So I would like to talk about a very special person, Reverend Robertus Junius, who had quite a controversial career as a missionary in Taiwan. And before I get into my story, perhaps I should make a few remarks about the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, and religious mission. Now, one of the particular things about Dutch expansion overseas was that the Dutch were never really interested in transferring the Christian religion to the local people in Asia, contrary to, for instance, the Portuguese and the Spaniards, who really were representatives to some extent, of the Pope in Asia. And now the funny thing is, and that's where Taiwan also is an exception, is that the colonial settlement in Taiwan was very much organized in the beginning by two missionaries, Mr. Candidius and Mr. Junius. And how that came about, I will tell you in a few minutes. Actually, these two dominees, these two zendelingen, these two missionaries were quite successful in the short period that they were at Taiwan. Now, as you know, the Dutch were only 38 years in Taiwan. And I'm always surprised that people are so much interested in the Dutch presence in Taiwan and what has remained of the Dutch presence in Taiwan. Well, a few ruins, actually. And that was, until very recently, the only thing that remained of the Dutch presence in Taiwan. Apart from the incredible archives of the Dutch East India Company, which we can find, hey, hello, yes, I haven't seen you for some time, here at The Hague, where the VOC archives are kept. And the interesting thing about those archives, so the most, until quite recently, until what I'm going to show you in a few minutes, the only really useful thing we had of that Dutch period in Taiwan were these fantastic archives, where, for instance, the governor of Taiwan, he kept a diary. And so he and his staff would keep a diary and write down what was happening in Taiwan and what they were organizing. And especially they would be describing the relationship with the local people, who in the beginning really only were the Aboriginal people. And then gradually the Dutch brought in many Chinese workers from the mainland, from China itself. So, as a joke, I once gave a talk in continental China and about the Dutch in Taiwan, and I said, well, I can tell you a secret, because Taiwan was actually made in Holland. And they said, what do you mean? I said, well, it was really the Dutch who brought in Chinese in large numbers during their colonial period, because they needed workers to develop the agriculture, and also many Chinese who were involved in commerce. Because before the Dutch arrived in Taiwan, of course, there were some Chinese living there, fishermen, and some local traders, but they were never settled down there. They just would come every season and then move out again, because the Aboriginal people really didn't want them to settle down at that moment. It's only the Dutch East India Company who brought them in. Well, and now let's move to my little talk. I'm going to show you a rather extraordinary picture, if this whole thing works. Yes, there it is. And what do we see here? Here we see Domine Robertus Junius, real name Robert de Jong, but they all had Latin names. And here we see his Christian believers in the church. The man there sitting on the upper side, and here below women, and here he is baptizing little children. Now, the extraordinary thing about this picture is that it was only discovered something like 5 years ago, when it was brought to the auction house of Christie's in London. And what does it say? It says a representation, here, this is where it is written, a representation of the dress, the figures, and congregations of new Christians in Formosa, in the village of Sulang, while the gospel is preached in their own language, very important, in their own language, by Reverend Robertus Junius in the year 1643. And then, oh surprise, it also says this was painted by a Chinese. And I don't know how close you can see this picture, but you see that this Chinese painter was actually very surprised by the wide-eyed expression of the Formosan Aborigines, and well, I think they look rather dull actually while they are listening to this preacher. But it's interesting. They all look rather different, and some are dressed up, and I will explain to you presently. And are wearing shoes, and others are like dressed up like warriors. There's also one is sitting over there, and most of them are barefooted, but these guys, they have shoes. And they probably work what we call the krankenbezoekers, well, really the representatives of the clergymen who were spread in all the different villages and teaching the people about the Christian religion. So they were especially dressed up like that. Now, why was this? How did this painting come about? Why? How did it end up in Europe? And what was really the meaning of it? Well, the protagonist of the whole painting is, of course, Mr. Junius, and it is clear that Junius himself has been painted by a Dutch artist, and not by the Chinese artist who made the whole painting, because we know there are several portraits of his that were made in Holland after he returned to the Netherlands, and he must have asked a Dutch artist to put his face, his portrait here on the painting. Now let me tell you a little bit about Junius and why he is portrayed here, and what made him such a special person. So, if we realize that the Dutch East India Company arrived in 1624 in Taiwan, really in order to establish trade with China on the other side of the Taiwan Strait, then you have to realize also that at the beginning, the Dutch merchants were not really that much interested in the population of Taiwan, or Formosa, as they called it themselves, Ilha Formosa, the beautiful island. But that only after a few years they got pulled into local society. And who was the person who pulled the company into local society? It was Mr. Candidius. It was the first minister, the first missionary, who came with the second governor of Taiwan, Mr. Pieter Nuits. And there's an interesting story, there are many interesting stories to tell about Mr. Pieter Nuits. But one of the funny things was that the poor man, he was not only appointed a governor of Taiwan only 2 years after the Dutch had arrived at the island. So, I mean, what he didn't know at all. He came straight from Netherlands. He didn't know anything about Asia. And he was appointed governor of a place that nobody really knew, right? The company was building a little castle at the entrance of the bay. And that bay is called Taiwan, so that is how the island got his name in the end. And but Mr. Nouts also first had to go to Japan to tell the shogun that from now on the Dutch would be in charge of Taiwan, and that Taiwan was going to belong to the Dutch East India Company. Well, you can understand that when Mr. Nouts arrived in Japan, the Japanese really ridiculed him, and they started laughing at him. He didn't even see the shogun, so he was sent back and all that. But while he was doing that, Mr. Cornelius, who had come together with him in Taiwan, he thought, well, this is very interesting, an island, and with this whole local population, why don't I, while the governor is not there, why don't I move into the nearest by village and start to learn the language and to find out who these people are? Now, when you realize that at that time, Formosa or Taiwan was a rather interesting society, because it was really made up by many different villages who were periodically fighting each other. On certain seasons of the year, they would be fighting each other, and they would go hunting. There was hardly any agriculture. And the interesting thing was that the men were trained as warriors and as hunters, and the women stayed at home, and they took care of the fishing in the coastal water, you know, knee deep, not farther than knee deep. They would walk into the sea and all that. And so the real mainstay in that sense, of the economy were the women, and also very importantly, religion belonged to the women. And the women were, so to say, ruled by priestesses. The Dutch called them witches, the so-called inips. And these inips had they could tell the men when they could go hunting, and when the rain would start, and when the rain would stop. And in order to do so, they would drink themselves completely crazy and get high, walk on the roofs of the local cabins, and start peeing on the roof. And then they started to prophesy what was going to happen. Now there arrives this Dutch reverend who wants to spread the gospel. And he said, my God, I mean, where do I start, you know, because this is all organized by women, and how can I get in touch with these people in any way? And then he also found out that because this was a hunter society, and they didn't want to have too many children, so that until the age of 30, the women had to abort themselves. And that abortion was carried out by these inips. So there was another point. I mean, here I arrive in a society where abortion is practiced until the age of 30. And he even found women who had been aborted 20 times before, at long last, at the age of 31 or 32, they were allowed to have their babies. So, what did he do? He started to write systematically down how this society was organized. And when Mr. Nouts came back from Japan and said, well, can you tell me something about what is happening here? And he said, oh, here it is. I've written down everything for you. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the first anthropological report that we have about the Siraya population. And Uma, who is now watching us from Taiwan, she is one of the sparse Siraya people left in that area. Well, so then, you know, you might wonder now, if you are a Dutch priest and you enter into this kind, for you, very strange society or community, which is occasionally fighting with the neighboring villages, headhunting people, right? Isn't that perhaps a little bit unsafe, you know? Why would you alone go and settle down there? Well, the interesting thing is that the Siraya people, so the local people of the village, thought this is very interesting. Let us pull this Dutchman into our village, because if this so-called missionary or whatever strange religion he's trying to spread amongst us, as long as he is amongst us, the neighboring villages certainly will not dare to attack us, because he is coming from the castle, right? Well, unfortunately, things didn't turn out like that. To cut a long story brief, soon there was a very big village of Matau with famous warriors who actually were one head taller than the Dutchmen who were walking around them. So very impressive people who started attacking the village, and Mr. Candidius was just in time back in the castle, so he survived. And he had only recently started to have a little bit of success among the local people. And that's also an interesting story, because an Inips came to him, one of these witches, and said, listen. You know, whatever we think about your religion, I think you have to prove to us that your religion is superior to our religion. He said, yes. And so what do you propose? Well, she says, you pick out a family and you make them Christians, and then in 1 or 2 years we will see whether these people are better off than the other people in the village. But as I told you, he didn't even get that far, because they were attacked from the neighboring village. And so Candidius went to the governor and said, look, now we have a problem, because there's no way in which I can continue with my spreading the religion in this village. If you do not stand on my side and on the side of this village, and that we have to revenge ourselves for having been attacked. Well, thought Mr. Nuits, perhaps not such a good idea. Oh, no, please don't say no. Let us at least attack one neighboring village, okay? We take a small one, and then. So that is what happened. They didn't dare to attack that big village, Matau, of course. And when the successor of Mr. Candidius, or a second clergyman, Mr. Junius, arrived, Junius said, okay, I will lead the people in attacking the neighboring villages, the enemy villages. And that was a great success. First of all, because the Siraya got the help from the Dutch East India Company, who would send a few soldiers. And then the strange thing was that while the clergyman, Candidius, had said, you should stop with headhunting, because that is bad, you know, you should be peaceful friends with the neighboring village. Now, for once, they were allowed to go headhunting against the enemy villages. And because this was such a successful enterprise, then very soon the other villages said, we want to become Christian too, because that means safety for our people. And to everybody's surprise, it was like an ink block. So very quickly, Candidius and Junius spread out this Protestant religion around the local people, just because the neighboring villages and the neighbor of the neighbor of the neighbor. They all came, they wanted to be part of this larger circle where they would be free from outside aggression. At least that's what they thought. Now, something new, what they introduced, Condidius and Junius, is that they learned the local language. And they started to teach the people not only to read and write, but they also, catechisms, they translated catechisms, and here we have a specialist on this, Mr. Toby, who has written just a big book about it, which I haven't read yet. You just show it to everybody, yeah. And if you want to become poor, buy this book, because what is it? It's 150.
200 euros.
How much is it?
200 euros.
200 euros, yeah. So I don't think this book will be sold to the Taiwan Aborigines in the near future. But anyhow, so Junius and Condidius started to preach, and then they got into another problem. Because they were so successful, then suddenly Zeelandia Castle, the Dutch East India Company, the governor, was facing a larger and larger population, which somehow had to be ruled, right? Because they had become part of this Dutch society, which was expanding and expanding. And of course they needed people, they needed personnel who would be able to talk to the local people and to explain to them, that from now on they also had to pay taxes. This was not a very welcome idea to most of the Aboriginals. They said, well, we are bringing peace here, we are bringing religion, and at least you should be participating in this whole venture by giving us every month, for instance, deer skins, because the Aboriginals, they were hunting deer, and those skins were very, very expensive because they were exported to Japan. And so the governor said to Mr. Junius, from now on you will also become a colonial official. And that, of course, was against his principles. He said, no, I'm here to transmit the religion, but okay, I will do this for a few years if you allow me to train people to take over. And that is what basically happened. So when he left in 1643, 1644, he made a tour with the governor through the whole territory that had been so-called Christianized. And at that occasion, to make a big impression on the governor, he organized here the baptism of the children, and he congregated there the villages together. Now, how do you think that the company could rule all these different communities who before had been fighting with each other? That was a very difficult problem. And so Junius said, what you should do, you should elect headmen, 3 or 4 headmen in every village, and then every year you should have a landdag, a diet, a congregation. You should bring them all together and give them lots of food to eat and drinks, so that those who were fighting each other in the past, that they would group together and and realize that you could be friends too. And that is really the way in which the Dutch East India Company in the following years ruled these people who had been fighting each other. Now, Mr. Junius comes back to the Netherlands, and this is what I was able to figure out. So he had this Chinese make this painting, And then, as when he arrived in Holland, he got his own portrait painted in there. And there he started to say, you know, what a wonderful work I did in the Far East, in Taiwan, and people all over the continent were impressed with it. There was also an Englishman who wrote, Chris, you must have written about this. How many people did he say that he baptized? 20,000?
5,900.
Oh, 5,900, yeah. Yeah, and little tegeltjes, tiles were made with the face of Mr. Junius on it. If you go to the Rijksmuseum, you can see a tile with the face of Mr. Junius, exactly the same face as this. And you can understand that the successors of Mr. Junius, who became priest in Taiwan, they all were very jealous of him because, you know, he went back to the Netherlands and actually he had collected quite a lot of money while he was in Taiwan. How had he done this? Because he had been collecting the tax, right? So apart from his normal income, he also had his extra tax income. And you can understand how his successors all hated him, hated this man. And there he was, you know, the great hero in the Netherlands and preaching in Delft and in Amsterdam and in Rotterdam. You know, here I am, Mr. Junius. And if you want to know, you know, how I did it, here's by the painting, right? And that painting disappeared afterwards. And it only popped up again 5 years ago. Now, we have been writing about this painting and, you know, and about all kinds of different things, how these people are dressed up and what it tells us and all that. But I would also like to add something else, and I'm writing an article about this. And that is, if we now understand that this really was a propaganda painting, how successful was he really? Was it such a big success? And the interesting thing is that there is, in a private archive, which has been kept, a correspondence left of Mr. Junius, Mr. Candidius, and the governor. And it turns out that those two clergymen were very, very scared that the Siraya people would turn against them because they wanted to have their own religion back. And there even was a moment that they found out about this conspiracy, which started in a very funny way, because Junius also had thought, you know, if these Taiwanese hunting people are hunting, always were hunting on food, you know, why don't we bring in hunting dogs? And so a few hunting dogs were introduced in Taiwan, and then at a certain moment, Junius said, I want my hunting dogs back, you know, and people said, no, these dogs are no. And so starting with a quarrel about this at a certain moment, they really wanted to get away with these clergymen who were also involved in the text organization. And fortunately, this conspiracy was found out, and from that moment onwards, these missionaries were better protected with soldiers and all that, and in that way, the religious mission could continue. Now, this is only a short note about the beginning of Dutch colonialism in Taiwan, and I haven't even been talking about the trade which was carried out between Taiwan and China and Japan, but I tell you that Taiwan became a very important hub of East Asian trade until the end. And how did the end come about? So the Dutch had been trying to get, already in the early 1620s, they had been trying to establish trade with the mainland, with mainland China. And how did they do that? They occupied Penghu Islands. But after 2 years, they were kicked out from the Penghu Islands by the governor of Fujian, who said, okay, you go to that island Formosa, Taiwan, which is outside our jurisdiction, wild people living there. And if you settle down there, you can trade from there, and we will send you ships over there. So we don't want Dutch ships on the Chinese coast, right? And that trade developed very well until there was a lot of piracy, which made this impossible. And the interesting thing is that one of the pirates was a former interpreter of the Dutch East India Company. And this man was called at the time Iquan, but we know him better now by the Chinese name Zheng Zhelong. Zheng Zhelong, 你知道Zheng Zhelong是谁？是陈世公的爸爸。So this Zheng Zhelong was such a successful pirate that in the end the Chinese officialdom invited him to come over to their side to keep away the other pirates. And this man became the most important official in the last years of the Ming dynasty. He knew the Dutch very well. He had been their interpreter, who had lived together with them in Japan, in the little village of Hirado. And like many Dutchmen, this Zheng Zhelong, alias Iquan, also had a Japanese girlfriend. And she gave birth to a son who later was called Zheng Zhenkong Koksingya. So, this, and I'm coming to the end with my story, then Zheng Zhelong, he was on the side of the Ming dynasty. The Ming dynasty collapsed in 1644. Then Zheng Zhelong thought he could surrender to the new dynasty, the Qing dynasty, the Manchus, because they promised him liberty and all that, but as soon as they had seized him, they sent him to Beijing. So he spent all his further life in Beijing. But his son, so this half Chinese, half Japanese boy, Zheng Zhenkong, he decided he wanted to continue fighting for the Ming troops. And he continued fighting from 1644 until the 1660s, in the early 1660s. And then when he saw that he no longer could keep the Qing troops away, then he escaped with his own troops to Taiwan and kicked out the Dutch. And that is how Taiwan really became Chinese at the time. So it's very interesting to see, you see all these personal connections which were at play. I will show you a few more pictures, if it works, and then we will have our cup of tea. What is it? It doesn't work. Here we have him again. This is the Zeelandia Castle. This was a map which was made by the Spaniards. By a Portuguese spy of the Spaniards. And here we see all in the beginning, the Zeelandia Castle, Chinese junks, Dutch ships. So this is the area where the Dutch established their colony, and the Spaniards over there. This was established in 1664, so you can understand. So last year we had the 400-year anniversary, and the Spaniards, they arrived in 1626. So there will be another occasion next year, and here we see a Formosan hunter. And he has, how do you call it, castanets in his hands. Clip, 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 and there he chases the deer, you see? The interesting thing is, perhaps you do not believe this, but that man or woman, but we can run longer than most animals, because animals can only lose their heat via their tongue or via their mouth, and we transpire all over the body. So they could just run infinitely, running. By the way, we were just talking at the introduction about the Zo people, who had this story that they were traced by the Dutch into the mountains. Is this the last one, perhaps? Yeah. Oh no. Here. So this is this is how the Formosans were portrayed at the time here in Dutch books. And here this is the Landdag. So here the representatives of the villages get together, and that's where the governor is sitting. And here we have the book, Chris, that we were just talking about, on the conversion of 5,900 East Indians. And this is Junius, as you can see him in the Rijksmuseum. And I think, oh yeah, and this is what Taiwan looked like at its best moment here with the castle, and this is the Chinese town. Well, I think this is about what I would like to tell you, and perhaps afterwards, if we will have a little bit discussion, if you have more questions. Let's discuss them then, because I think my time is up. No.